renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
The power of the presidency is often thought to reside within this Oval Office, yet it doesn't rest here. It rests in you, the American people, and in your trust.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak.
We act to prevent a wider war, to defuse a powder keg at the heart of Europe that has exploded twice before in this century with catastrophic results. And we act to stand united with our allies for peace.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Syria's apparent willingness to allow oversight of its chemical weapons seems to have tempered an urgent international crisis. And for just the 9th time in his presidency, Obama will directly address the nation from the White House tonight and lay out his assessment of recent developments and attempt to sway a deeply skeptical American public. Joining me to discuss tonight's speech and how President Obama's Syria pitch will change is presidential historian Richard Norton Smith and Frank Sesno. Frank is a former White House correspondent and currently the director of the School of Media and Public Affairs at the George Washington University. That's a mouthful. Thanks for being with us today, guys. Richard, I want to start with you. You're sort of the grand historian here. These speeches have often been game changers, but they're always memorable speeches. Talk a little bit about that.
They're game changers, but the game has changed. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. We're talking about, Harry Truman famously said, the chief function of the modern presidency is to persuade.
Right.
Is to convince people to do what they ought to do but don't want to do.
Right.
And we saw a number of examples of that. The president has, quite apart from the specifics of this particular argument, a real uphill task tonight. Because over the years, the bully pulpit, made famous by T.R., Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats.
That's right.
It's a totally different media and political climate in which the president operates today. 40 years ago, Richard Nixon's men in the White House could call 3 people in towers in New York and be assured of having an audience that night of 70 million people. And the only immediate response was poor Eric Sevareid offering what was called instant analysis. Today, there's no guarantee, tonight being an exception,
that's right,
of a president being on the networks. And instead, there is a guarantee that there are millions of self-appointed Sevareids who are twittering their instant analysis before the president even finishes his speech.
And Frank, how do you feel like this White House, this administration has already done so far with the messaging, keeping in mind of this very much changed landscape?
Terribly. I mean, in a word, it's a muddled message. It's a reluctant warrior. The narrative of the story itself is so complex and confusing that the public is lost. Added to the fact that there is no single bully pulpit anymore,
right,
It makes it very difficult. So what is the story? It's the now diplomatic initiative. It's the still pending military threat. It's the moral outrage of using chemical weapons. It's America's national security, which any president, in those clips that you had, in every case, the president went from the Oval Office and made a clear and largely compelling case that America's national interests were on the line, and that's why America's blood and treasure could be spilled.
Right.
And I don't think that has happened even close
Richard,
to
you want to jump in here?
Well, no, I was just going to say, the interesting thing, though, is part of this, again, is the role of the media. We have 24/7 news cycle. We have a White House figuratively ringed with satellite trucks.
Right.
The single greatest danger a modern president may confront is overexposure. There are so many people obsessing on the process. I have a hunch, if we went back 50 years and they looked at the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we now know evolved over those 10, 12 days, whatever, very dramatically as the president and those around him tested out potential scenarios, potential strategies. If we covered the Cuban Missile Crisis with the intensity that we look at today's foreign policy developments, I'm not sure we would have the same historical perspective of what is seen as one of JFK's great
times.
I think this is a really interesting point. Imagine if we had all the social media, all the cable channels, all the online video information streams on the eve of D-Day.
Yeah, we would
through
be
all these years of
processing
war.
every single moment and every single back and forth.
Every single moment. What's the cost? What are the consequences?
What did this speech mean? What did that? Yeah.
Have you got this ally, that ally? Let's play it all. It's very hard to conduct war and foreign policy in under a microscope.
Richard
we forget the men who wrote the Constitution. The first thing they decided when they met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 was to keep the deliberations private. No one was let in, and certainly no media were let in.
Right, and we are obviously tweeting and reporting everything as it goes, and this story very much a moving target. Richard, I wonder, is there a sort of template or speech, primetime speech, that you look to that Obama should perhaps look to when he makes his big speech tonight?
It's curious because I think it is inseparable from the larger media climate, which really does tip the scales in many ways. But oddly enough, if you go back to the Nixon White House, in the fall of 1969, Nixon had lost the initiative, or was in danger of losing the initiative, to the anti-Vietnam movement. The moratoriums, the monthly demonstrations in Washington were gaining momentum. And Nixon, who seemed to be kind of fumbling for a Vietnam policy, and he went up to Camp David, characteristically, holed up. He came back, and he gave what became known as the silent majority speech. And the remarkable thing about that speech, it moved the numbers. His favorability ratings went up 16 points overnight. He got a 77% positive approval, for the policies laid out. But more important, he took back the initiative on Vietnam. Can a president do that in this political climate? Not, I think, with the hand that this president has been dealt.
In terms of the conflict and the media landscape, you feel like it's an impossibility?
Oh, I don't think it's ever an impossibility, but I think it's very difficult. And the example that I was thinking as you were speaking, when you asked about a similar speech, was actually when Ronald Reagan went to the country and talked about the Contras, the Nicaraguan Contras, and he called them the moral equivalent of our founding fathers.
Yeah.
But and he threw every bit, and he was at a very different place in his presidency then. And we were not as war-weary as we are now. He threw everything he could at that. And we lived at a time of the Cold War. So we looked at Nicaragua in the prism of sort of an East-West conflict. And even then, he couldn't persuade the Congress because he couldn't make the connection between the Contras and America's fundamental national security. That's Obama's challenge tonight. Can he connect the chemical weapons attack to America's national security?
And memory matters. People in the 80s still very much had Vietnam in the collective consciousness, just as we tonight are going to watch this speech with Iraq very much in our awareness.
In mind. There were reports early on that this was going to be in the Oval Office. It looks like it's going to be in the East Room now. Does that matter at all?
Yeah,
sort of staging of it?
Oh, yes. Michael Deaver used to say, my job is to light the president. It was Ronald Reagan's and he knew that the visual trappings around the president mattered. The Oval Office conveys something of, we are at war importance, or this is an address of monumental national importance. So to me, it's a ratcheting down of that importance. It is more a talk than it is an Oval Office address.
Right, and it might be less about persuasion tonight as well, because we have all of this other movement going on in terms of Syria.
I think that's one of the most interesting things, because what is he really trying to do tonight? He's not going to say, my fellow Americans, 2 minutes ago I launched an attack.
Right.
He's not going to do that. Is he even going to say, my fellow Americans, 2 weeks from now, we must launch an attack?
There's Obama the professor. There is and education and persuasion are not always one and the same. One may precede the other. Because the other danger that he runs in moving this out of the Oval Office is Jimmy Carter's famous energy speech, where he wore a cardigan sweater thinking that he would make this point. And it's really the only thing people remember from the speech.
Is this the Malay speech?
No,
this was an early we need to turn down
I think it was his first speech, and it was seen as
sitting by the fireplace.
It was seen as
it was all chatty, folks.
Oddly unpresidential.
Okay, so that's one that comes to mind. I was reading today, something like 200 historians, they had a survey and they gave Obama a B- in terms of his presidency so far. Frank, any grade for this president so far?
Well, because I come from a university, you want me to grade?
Yeah, he got low marks on communication with Congress, congressional relations, and transparency.
Well, I would do the journalistically appropriate and,
Which is very
politically
objective,
correct.
straight down.
I would give him an incomplete.
Yes, there you go. There you go.
Look, he got his Nobel Peace Prize maybe a little early.
Yeah,
that was sort of
so.
a down payment on what you're going to do. I certainly would say that in the realm of this particular issue and communicating this issue, he's done quite poorly.
Yeah.
The rhetoric and the passion have not matched the
Was
reality.
it a mistake to get out yesterday with those 6 round robin
Was it a mistake
interviews?
to get out? No, I think was it maybe because
He's
you kind of
stepping on his own message from tonight.
You may step on your message. You may sort of diffuse the message. You may kind of undermine it a little bit because you make it too common in a sense. Presidential communication, by definition, at least in the past, has been something special. And when you're going and you're holding Google town hall meetings and going on Jay Leno and going on the Daily Show and doing 6 interviews all at once and then trying to rally the nation.
It becomes like airport TV. You're like barely
the danger of overexposure.
Yeah,
that's right.
You know, and again, it's hard when you've got this 24/7 news cycle, in effect, not to fall victim.
But I want to take you back, and I was a very small young person at the time, but I remember vividly after Bobby Kennedy was shot. And I was growing up in the New York area, and there were 3 network stations, and there were 2 non-network stations, and with a funny antenna, there was a UHF PBS station.
Yes.
The 3 network stations all went to their coverage, and one of the other stations, they didn't have anything to do, so they just put up a still. It just said shame.
Okay,
It was amazing.
Yeah.
But anybody and everybody who watched television was watching one thing. That will not happen tonight because you have 800 channels out there.
Yeah, that's right. Richard, you obviously presidential historian. I see that you are reading now the biography of Woodrow Wilson. Is there a president that Obama reminds you of?
Well, that's an interesting thing. Quite by accident, I've said he's the most cerebral, but in many ways the most professorial. Now, to some people, that's a pejorative,
right?
And that's part of the Wilsonian legacy.
Yes.
Tonight, it's fascinating because I think we're going to see the tutorial Obama. He's not a cheerleader, and he's certainly not a militarist. He's a very reluctant. He's not a happy warrior.
Yes, he's a reluctant.
He's a very,
warrior.
very reluctant warrior, and I'm not sure the tutorial. I'm not sure, what effect that will have on Congress. A good friend of mine, who shall remain nameless, but someone who really knows this town inside out, says Congress excels at 2 things: overreacting and doing nothing. And we've seen both this week. And I think they would dearly love to find a way to do nothing and avoid making a very difficult decision.
I think if the president is going to be effective tonight, he does have to be the educator in chief, but he has to do more than educate in kind of in a cold, bloodless way. This is not the moral equivalent, certainly, but it is of a place not unlike discovering concentration camps. I mean, if you're going to go to war over a humanitarian outrage, this is Rwanda. We didn't act in Rwanda. Bill Clinton has always said Rwanda is his big regret.
Right.
100,000 people
And some
died.
advisors in this White House are from that administration.
That's right. And that's what they remember. Right. But how do you bring the country along? How do you elevate the issue and the passion without being irresponsible?
Plus, plus a country that's severely polarized, not just about policy, but about personality.
And war.
How do you stand in the bully pulpit and convince a congregation, half of which
doesn't really
questions
be there.
your legitimacy,
right?
Thinks you shouldn't even be there? That's a unique challenge that this president confronts, and that more recent presidents, it's become a problem. I mean, look, 4 of the last 5 presidents have been, quote, polarizing figures. And with each, in some ways, the impact of the bully pulpit is diminished.
Has diminished, right?
It's really interesting, too, because what is he going to argue? He can't argue that, well, America's credibility is on the line. You don't go to war over credibility, right? That's not what's going to move people. He can't say oil is at the line because last time I checked, the Syrians don't produce very much oil.
Right.
Regional stability, instability, we've been hearing about that for a very long time.
And these are all arguments to a certain extent that they are making. Which
That's
one
right.
argument does he settle on?
Which one does he
Is it
settle
the
on?
idea of chemical weapons are bad, we have to uphold this international standard, which seems to be
plus
maybe the best argument.
Perceived failure of the Arab Spring, or at least the failure of the Arab Spring to realize what we thought 2 years ago it might be, is also an inseparable part of the context. I mean, there is just this overwhelming desire to turn the page.
Yes, move forward. And
the
so
irony,
turn our back, right?
The president who wanted to be known as the man who got us out of ill-advised Middle East entanglements finds himself entangled.
Yes,
Well, and we're also dealing with here, and he's dealing with here. That's one of the ironies. The other irony is, you know, he's tried to say we're not the world's policeman, but we have to be the worldld's policeman.
Yes.
Because there aren't very many other policemen out
Right,
there.
not many others willing to stand up. Frank Sesno, Richard Norton Smith, thank you so much
Thank you.
for joining me today. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks again to our guests for being with us, and thank you for watching. Send us your thoughts on Twitter. Find us at Background and use that hashtag #PostBack. We'll see you right back here tomorrow.